Yesterday we left off with verse 14. Oh, satisfy us early with thy mercy that we may rejoice and be glad all our days. Verse 15 is interesting. And I think it's an interesting prayer, and it teaches us something about prayer and about the heart of God for his followers. Moses says, and he's continuing the thought of verse 14, make us glad according to the days wherein thou hast afflicted us, and the years wherein we have seen evil. Make us glad according to the days wherein thou hast afflicted us, and the years wherein we have seen evil. The word evil in the Old Testament is a more generic word than we think of today. Okay, we think of evil in terms of overtly evil, like sinful, wicked, diabolical, devilish. And that is a fine application context of the word, but that's not always the sense of it in the Old Testament. Otherwise, you get the sense that God has a diabolical side, which is not the case. So when he talks about experiencing evil, he's talking about experiencing bad or hard things, difficult things, trials, tragedy, cataclysmic events. So like the Old Testament would refer to natural disasters as evil, calamity, okay? That's another word for it. So Moses says, God, I'm asking you for a kind of gladness that is in proportion, in magnitude, the number of days, in proportion to the way we have been afflicted. The word afflicted is a reply or a response. So what he's referring to in the affliction is God's response to their rebellion. God's response was 40 years of wandering the desert. You're all going to perish. Your children are going to grow up, and the next generation is going to go into the promised land. So that's the affliction that Moses is talking about. And it was affliction that they really brought on themselves, but it was affliction that God ordained, that God allowed as a chastening result of their bad decisions. So what Moses is really doing is he's teasing out the idea of mercy. He's saying, God, let your mercy fill us up, satisfy us, and produce rejoicing and gladness all our days. And God, sooner than later, could you make us so glad? Could our gladness outproportion the magnitude of our sorrow for having rebelled against you? Would it just flood it out? Would it overwhelm us? I see here a bit of a math equation. And I'm thinking of it this way. It was a big day in my math career as an elementary and junior high student when I was taught negative numbers. It kind of blew my mind at first. Like when you get to zero, you're at zero. How can you have less than zero? Okay. But in reality, reality, I guess you can't have less than zero, but mathematically you can. Okay. So theoretically you can. So you can have -1 or -5 or -10. So if the gladness scale, the joy factor, is anything into the positive numbers, okay, if joy and fulfillment and fullness was a scale, Moses in really the whole psalm up until verse 14 and 15, he feels that they're in the negative. Now he understands that's because of sin. But he also understands God is 100,000% infinitely really in the positive. He is the sum total. He is the very definition of joy and gladness and love and peace and hope and all the good things that the heart could crave. So he says, God, we're in the negative. We have had 40 years of sorrow. And so imagine a pendulum swing into the negative spectrum of a number chart to the -40 mark. And Moses says, God, your mercy is going to fill us. Your mercy is going to satisfy us. But God, let it be so quickly, so early, so immediate that we immediately become glad. We go positive much farther than we were in the negative, or at least to the equal opposite extreme. So swing 40 back to zero, so now you're at zero, and then 40 to the positive puts you really double of what you were. I'm just thinking mathematically, okay? Probably getting into the weeds a little bit. My point is, Moses has this sense that when God is actually merciful, he's going to be immediately, abundantly, unequivocally merciful. He's going to be comprehensively good, and it's going to erase the experience. It's going to be so overwhelming that it's going to bring the net impact of the negative experience is going to be net zero. Okay, it's going to be inconsequential when the math is done. Okay, another illustration that might probably strike home better would be when all of our children were born. Dana was really suffering in those pregnancies. She was carrying, and she was hurting, and it was painful and uncomfortable and burdensome and tiresome, and I mean it was miserable. With Haley in particular, she was in a long early labor and for months on bed rest, and then she was for many weeks in the hospital on Pitocin and other medications to keep her from delivering early so that Haley would not be too premature. As it was, Haley, I think, was 6 or 7 weeks premature. And it was a really tenuous situation. And I remember in particular one day, Dana was exasperated. I was exasperated. We were so conflicted. She was so miserable, and we were being told different things by different doctors. And I remember one doctor really kind of lecturing me and saying, listen, you help your wife. We know what we're doing. We need to do this. She's going to get through this. But then the doctor said, when that baby is born, she won't remember any of this. Now, does she remember it? Of course. But the joy of holding Haley and the joy of beginning to nurse and nurture that little girl forward, it made the endurance of the hardship fade away into oblivion. It was inconsequential. And I guess that's the word that probably best summarizes this verse 15. God, could you take my sorrow and my affliction? Could you take the hard stuff, and could you bring a resulting gladness from it that makes the hard stuff inconsequential? Maybe that even makes the hard stuff worth it someday, that I could look back on it and say, thank you for the hard stuff, because look how it resulted in such exponentially better multiplied gladness. So, my friend, takeaways today, real quick. It's okay to ask God for gladness. It's okay to lift your suffering and hardship to God and say, God, I'm trusting you that you're going to, I don't like the word compensate in terms of payment. I like it in terms of reconciling the books, though, okay? That God's going to swing the pendulum into the positive so much in your life that your joy is going to swallow up your one-time endurance, your one-time hardship. You say, well, I don't see it. I don't feel it. How long? How long? Well, that's okay. You're still in verse 13. How long? How long? But this is what God does, okay? So be hopeful, my friend, because the balance sheet isn't done yet, okay? The statement hasn't been printed, and God's still at work in your life. And your gladness will sweep into your life as a result of his grace and mercy, and it will fill you up to the brink, to the point that the deficit will be completely washed away. You will never stand before God face to face feeling that he owes you anything for your suffering. He will make the record right. That's what he does.